Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for a special edition of the Liberty Report. We're bringing you a story that's in the news today. It's on the top of Drudge. It's a top story now on Zero Hedge. Everyone's talking about it. It has to do with something happened over Sunday, which was the banning of several people on Twitter, myself included. And the story has been talked about in parts and in pieces, but we decided that we need to get the whole story, the whole context, and to make the point that the story is not about us, those of us who were suspended and banned, but there's a bigger issue at play. And so we're bringing together two of our good friends, Peter Van Buren, a former State Department official and whistleblower, author of We Meant Well, one of the best books about the Iraq War, and our great friend Scott Horton of the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com and the Scott Horton Show. Both of these gentlemen were sent to Twitter purgatory. I think Peter's been sent to Twitter hell. He can't get back, but we want to give the whole story. We want to run it down from the beginning of what happened. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Peter. Peter is the one that started all this, and let's have the background and leading us up to what happened finally.
Well, when you pull the tail of the tiger, sometimes you get bit. And apparently I pulled that tail one too many times on Twitter. Essentially on Sunday, Glenn Greenwald had begun a thread saying that the mainstream media in the United States had helped promote America's wars over the years, and that by their silence, they continue to encourage the United States to intervene militarily overseas. I picked up on this and jumped into the thread explaining that during my time in Iraq working for the State Department, a time that I initially was still red, white, and blue government official, I frequently lied to the media. I lied to them about how things were going. I lied to them about how successful we were, and that it was my colleagues and I were contemptuous of them. Most of the people that we talked to in the media didn't know enough to ask important questions. Most of them didn't care enough to ask questions and simply jotted down whatever we told them. And it was just remarkably easy to fool them. It's almost as if they wanted to play along with us. At one point, I described it as they weren't looking for the story, just a story. And I made some remarks about how many of them were more concerned about looking good in their stand-ups, getting their makeup on straight, than looking for details or questioning the lies that the government put forward. Well, this caused the great mass of journalists on Twitter to rise up and condemn me in a number of ugly ways, calling me names and things like that. In the weird, ironic way that Twitter works, my conversion from government drone to whistleblower was offered as proof that I can't be trusted today. You know, if I changed my position so dramatically to become a whistleblower, maybe I'm today just making things up once again. And it got very aggressive. And I was insulted and called a lot of names. I gave as good as I got, and then one of the people in the chain reported me to Twitter as encouraging violence, and under the black box that is Twitter's corporate censorship. Without notice, I was permanently banned from Twitter, and as far as I know, everything I've ever written there over the last 7 years has been removed down the memory hole. I no longer exist on Twitter as We Meant Well. That basically brings us up to date, but I do want to add that I wish people did not have to decide right now whether to take my word on what happened or not. I wish that they would be able to go to Twitter right now and read as much of the exchanges as they want to and come to their own conclusion about what I said, what was said to me, whether I deserve a place in the marketplace of ideas anymore or not. Because this is the worst thing about censorship. The key thing about censorship is it takes the right and the responsibility and the privilege away from people to make decisions about what's right and wrong based on what they read, and simply allows Twitter to tell you, Peter Van Buren is no longer worthy of being listened to. That's the danger of censorship. That's the danger of corporate censorship, and that's what we're really talking about here, not my tweets.
Yeah, and this, if I could just add, Peter, this was in the context of President Trump's tweets or comments earlier that weekend about the press being the enemy of the people, and how and I guess toward the end of last week, and how, of course, the media was in a frenzy. Acosta of CNN was in a frenzy. Everyone is in a frenzy over this, and I think that's what spurred Glenn Greenwald and then you to join in. But it is remarkable. But you make a good point about the silencing you, and you have some very devoted followers. Your tweets can be very spicy, to the point, very pointed, very probing, very insightful, and you have a lot of very dedicated fans. That piece of history is simply gone. As you say, it doesn't exist.
You know, the thing about words and things like that, whatever, first of all, I think most of us are adults. We've heard bad words before. I don't know that too many people are shocked, but let's say you are. Let's say you find what I write offensive. Twitter allows you to block me, to mute me. No one forces you to look at what I write, and if you don't want to see it, you have the options to make me go away as you wish. In fact, the idea that Twitter needs to purge people and their ideas, as they did to me, as they did on a shorter term basis to you and Scott Horton, as they've done on a more comprehensive basis to people like Alex Jones and a lot of smaller folks that we don't know about or haven't heard about. The idea is that they don't need to do that. The whole point of free speech is to have the full menu of ideas available so that people can choose what they wish to read and how they wish to react to it, and to provide them with tools. In the old days, it was simply as easy as closing the book. Today, it's simply as easy clicking the block button or the mute button and make your decisions about who you want to listen to and what ideas you want to be exposed to. The concept of corporate censorship reaches beyond protecting people, which is, I think, what Twitter would argue they are doing, and reaches into silencing people so that they can cut off debate, so that they can close down the range of ideas that are available to everyone, so that they can exert power in the marketplace of ideas to shift people's opinions towards the particular political point of view that they want to put across, as opposed to what they claim to be, which is a platform for open discussion.
And the brilliance of the social media is that we all become our own editors. We decide, we craft our own, and Twitter was great about that. You craft your own sources in a way. But let's move it over to Scott, because Scott, you and I were both at the same time watching what was happening live with Peter. We were watching the beat up on Peter. We were, I think, if I can speak for you, we were both fascinated by the points that Peter was making. Very good points, and pretty shocked by the pile-on. Maybe if you can take it up from your perspective, when you were sitting there watching this happen, and then what ultimately happened to you.
Right. Well, so the thing that got Peter banned was he said to Jonathan Katz, which is at Katz on Earth is this handle there. Not that anyone should at him, but there are different people with the same name on Twitter, so I just want to be specific there. And Peter said something that was clearly in jest. I hope a MAGA guy eats your face. A MAGA being, make America great again. And the reference there obviously being, to this liberal media guy's perspective that Trump supporters are all a bunch of zombies. And so Peter was saying, I hope one of these zombies eats your face, basically. And this became the opportunity for Jonathan Katz, and he said outright, I'm going to report you for promoting violence. He announced to Peter that I'm going to tattletale on you and get you in trouble. And I think that's a big part of what's going on here is somebody like Jonathan Katz basically punching down and trying to get alternative media people in trouble for challenging the prevailing orthodoxy here. And in fact, the New York Times just ran a piece the other day about how Twitter is such a horrible place because, we have New York Times journalists who, know all the right and best things to say about everything. And then we have all these scumbags who have basically equal station and can talk right back and say whatever they want and express opinions that New York Times types don't think should be allowed. So Peter Van Buren didn't tattletale on Jonathan Katz and try to get Jonathan Katz in trouble. And I'm not sure if it was Katz himself who tattletaled on you and I, although I suspect it probably was. But the point is that they're trying to eliminate the competition. All these, yapping voices from below who refuse to accept their orthodox opinions and points of view on everything, we're to be purged. And so this guy Katz didn't hesitate 1 minute to try to get and to succeed in getting Peter kicked off of there. And then Peter then sent me screenshots of the tweet that got him fired, and including the shot of Jonathan Katz saying, "I'm going to tell on you." And so then I tweeted that this guy, Jonathan Katz, what a boo-hoo little B-word he is, that he would go tattletaling to teacher and get Peter Van Buren fired. And then, of course, all you did was RT me and agree about this guy Katz. And that was enough to get both of us at least temporarily suspended, as you said, put in Twitter purgatory, if not Twitter hell, and completely banished forever, as happened to Peter Van Buren. And yet, look at what we're talking about here. The B word. Eric Garris from antiwar.com did a search on Twitter and got millions and millions of results for the B word. Matt Taibbi, the reporter from Rolling Stone magazine, who had just done a story in the last week called "Be Careful What You Wish For" with Facebook censorship, saying you have all these people who are very happy to see Alex Jones kicked off, but you very well could be next, because, look at who is doing the deciding here. Well, he wrote to me and asked about it. I sent him the screenshots and everything and showed him, Twitter had, when I try to log in, they show me my tweet that was so-called broke the rules here. And Taibbi said that he contacted Twitter's public relations department demanding an explanation because, as he put it, if using the B word on Twitter is enough to get you banned, then half the site is going to have to log off, right? This is supposedly promoting violence or gender discrimination or some kind of thing. I mean, maybe Jonathan Katz is actually not a man, and so that's why he takes it that way. But it seems pretty ridiculous. As Peter said, it was an excuse. It's the thinnest of hook to hang us on, and Katz had no trouble in going for it, and so here we are.
I think, Scott, you make a good point. This seems to me another example of how the so-called legacy media, for what it's worth, is terrified of losing the narrative. The fact that we can not only go in and get rough and tumble with these exalted New York Times people, but we can actually refute some of the things that they're writing in real time on Twitter, I think is very dangerous to their hold on the narrative. And I just couldn't help getting the feeling, as I was watching this unravel in real time, that Katz wasn't acting alone. I had the feeling that he was tagging a lot of his buddies and getting them to go along and all report Peter at the same time. So all of a sudden, Twitter is bombarded with 100 or so complaints. This horrible guy, Peter Van Buren, he's running around threatening to eat people's faces. We've got to stop this before it gets out of hand, But it seems like they're gaming the system by ganging up on people and doing that. And I wonder if that's indeed what they did.
Well, you've got a terrible set of convergences here. You essentially have the equivalent of mob violence backed up by anonymous corporate censorship. And you put those two things together, and you end up with exactly what happened here. There are a number of voices on Twitter, mine included, simply disappeared. And whether we had anything useful to say or not is no longer relevant, because we no longer exist as part of the debate. I want to throw something in a little bit to the side of things, because I know someone's out there listening and is ready, is chafing to say, but the First Amendment doesn't apply to Twitter. They're a private company. That's absolutely correct. The First Amendment applies to the government. But you want to think a little bigger than jailhouse lawyers here. Thomas Jefferson wrote about how free speech is an inalienable right. It exists independent of governments. And like it or not, Twitter and Facebook and these other places have become the public stage of the 21st century. And they hold both the power to ban speakers, as has been done to me, and to prevent listeners. In other words, Alex Jones can create a video somewhere else, but he can't even post it on a site. Now, once you start doing that, you are in fact stepping into the role of government. You're acting as a proxy censor for government. Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, has taken that a step further. Ironically, on Twitter, he has called for the social media companies, specifically Facebook and Twitter, to be even more aggressive about censoring. And he has implied in his tweets that essentially, hey, for now at least, the government has its hand tied by this old-timey First Amendment, but you corporations, you can do anything you want, and it's up to you to clean this riffraff up, at least before the midterms come. And so the First Amendment argument is both true and irrelevant simultaneously. It requires people to think much bigger than themselves and much bigger than playing with rules in a way that somehow shapes a narrative that they want, which is essentially we no longer as a country are willing to defend the rights of others to speak independent of their content. We will defend the rights of those to speak who agree with us and ruthlessly use whatever tools are available to silence those who disagree with us. If that is not a recipe for fascism independent of everything else that may be on people's minds, I don't know what is. We remain
the other thing here is, being outright banned as Peter has been, or temporarily banned as you and I have been, Dan, is, beside the point of what we've already been suffering here for a few years, which is what they call shadow banning and just the tweaking of the algorithms. I think it was the World Socialist website who first pointed out, but this has been a story that's been developed further, where left-wing sites such as, and in fact, just barely left of center sites like Truthdig and Truthout and Naked Capitalism, and some of these have been censored, along with antiwar.com and the Ron Paul Institute and others, by Google and by Facebook and by Twitter, where we post what we post, and we're not really necessarily banned. We're not prevented from posting, but our work is not shared. And I know that you've written in the past, Dan, about the traffic that the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity gets from Facebook has just gone down completely by this same sort of shadow banning type censorship. Of course, the same thing has happened to antiwar.com, where I work. And this is something that Taibbi wrote about in his recent report for Rolling Stone too. Is you see how nefarious this is, where they can't kick the Ron Paul Institute off the internet, but they can make sure that nobody can see it. And by the way, and much of this was in the name of the Russian attack on our election and Russian disinformation, and yet they had no examples of the Ron Paul Institute or antiwar.com or Naked Capitalism or Truthdig or Truthout or the World Socialist website actually putting out what you could call fake news, like the Pope endorses Trump, or these kind of hoax news stories. Instead, we just ran articles where we talked about things from something other than the New York Times point of view. Maybe our problems with Russia don't all originate in Moscow. Maybe some of them originate in Washington, D.C. Maybe our policies in Ukraine and Syria need some further analysis so that we can understand our conflict, such as it is with Russia now. And that counts as fake news because an anonymous group called Prop or Not says so. And the Washington Post goes along. And so this is the kind of thing that can be happening to all of us, and there's really no one to complain to, and there's nothing to do about it.
The last time, I'm now silent on Twitter. I no longer exist there. It's ironic to me. The last time that I was unable to comment on Twitter was in May when I visited Iran. The Iranian government blocks Twitter entirely there, and I could not read tweets, nor could I transmit tweets, because the Iranian government made a decision that no one in Iran should see what I have to say. Well,
but Peter, we're number one.
It's ironic that now in America, I'm once again silenced. I cannot speak to people because, in this case, not a government, but a corporation acting as if they were the government has decided that what I have to say is not worth announcing and not worth publicly. You go back to this question of shadow banning. Think of it in Jefferson's day. In Thomas Jefferson's day, people assembled in the town square to hear speakers. Imagine if in Jefferson's day someone said, well, Dan, you're allowed to stand on a tall ladder and use a big megaphone. Scott, you have to go behind the rocks and whisper. And that would be roughly the equivalent of what's going on here. And to try to pretend that represents free speech in its realistic forms, the way that many people do when they say, well, gosh, they're a private company, shadow banning, blah, blah, blah. I mean, think of that analogy, because that is more complete. This is an insidious development for a democracy, where the tools of communication, the public square of the day, is controlled by corporations, which are unfettered and irresponsible and have no transparency. That's always been a problem. But I think what is worse is that in 2018, a large and perhaps growing portion of Americans not only accept that, they demand more of it. The glee that many people expressed online that I was banned, that Twitter doesn't have to worry about that old-timey First Amendment. They can actually strike as sharply and as quickly and without explanation. The glee that people express that a university has uninvited a speaker, deplatforming him in the modern terminology. The glee that people express by saying, well, good, those Trumpkins can't get on Facebook anymore and tell us what to do. That glee is as anti-democratic as anything I've encountered in my living lifetime, and harkens back to the 1950s and Joseph McCarthy, when simply pointing a finger at someone and saying communist was enough to destroy their lives. Today we simply say hate speech, and it does the same.
Or Russia. It is one of the things that I found particularly chilling, and I'm going to write about this, I think. And Scott, you alluded to it, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. And before, I want to do one other thing before we close out, which is to talk about what next. But just a point I'd like to make is, like you, Scott, when I went to re-log into my account, it has not disappeared, but a big post comes up. This is the post that they found offensive, and they gave me a nice little list of what I was doing. I was threatening violence and what have you. It did nothing of the sort. But before I go any further, there's a big red button that says delete. And the message for them to me is, you delete this first before you can do anything else. Which to me is sort of like a Stalinist recantation. They have all the power in the world to delete that one tweet if they do believe that it is so offensive, it's driving people mad and this sort of thing, it's against the rules. But no, they want you to do it. It's sort of someone else said this to me earlier, it's sort of a behavioralist sort of thing to recondition you. You are responsible. You've got to back down. You have to admit your guilt and your fault before you can go further. And that seems, at the very least, a little weird. But
Dan, it's been maybe a few too many years since you've read 1984 by George Orwell. The torture of the protagonist, Winston, was not to get him to confess to his crimes. The state already knew what he did. The torture that was applied to him was to get him to admit that he loved Big Brother.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Well, we want to bring this to a close, but this is a difficult question for which I don't have an answer. I think, Peter, you have a pretty good idea. You've expressed it pretty well how you view it. My instinct is the last thing I want is the state to be involved in anything, anything full stop. And certainly not to get involved in this, because I think, Peter, as you suggest, I think the state loves this. They love the fact that Twitter and Facebook are doing its job for them. They're narrowing the acceptable level of debate, which just happens to favor them. I don't know what the solution is, but I'd like to throw it back to you two gentlemen to think, how might we address this, keeping in mind particularly Scott and I's disdain for everything that has to do with the state?
Well, speaking of these companies working for the state, I want to point out that Google is about to deploy a modified version of its search engine called Dragonfly in China that uses the Chinese government's list of what they prefer to call anti-social websites that will no longer appear in Google's search results inside of China. So you substitute hate speech for anti-social, and you see that Google is working hand in glove with the Chinese government to censor. I think the answer here lies with us. If a growing number of Americans, and they appear to be, forgive me, they appear to be millennial age Americans, if a growing number of Americans would stop demanding censorship and cheering it on when it happens, Twitter's business case to censor would start to fade away. Twitter's a business. It exists to make money. It doesn't care about you or me. It cares about money. And if the money is on the side of censorship, then they are going to censor. If we as a people fall back to what was the standard of, gosh, it was all of 2 years ago, defending someone's right to speak, even if you disagree with the content of their speech. If we simply fall back to that as our way of looking at these things, then Twitter and Facebook and the others will simply not have a reason to censor, will not have an encouragement to censor. But the more that people like Chris Murphy encourage them to do that, the more that people gleefully pile on and say, we're so glad you stopped Peter Van Buren or Dan or Scott, the more that people do that, the more that's going to happen. We all know where this ends. We all know in history when governments and corporations and entities begin censoring, they don't stop. It becomes a very powerful tool to shape things, and there's not an end to it. It's just a matter of time before they come for you, and then they come for me, and they come for the next person. We all know that poem as well. So I think step one would be for people to demand of the social media platforms to simply stop censoring. Use the block button, use the mute button, but don't demand that someone be disappeared because you disagree with them.
That sounds good. Scott, your closing thoughts on what we might do about this, or what's the solution?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think, as you guys have both said, we need to reiterate the principle behind free speech in the first place. Obviously, it's our natural right. We're born screaming, and we can say whatever we want. No one has the right to stop us in that sense. But there's, a very important utilitarian purpose here too, and that is power is virtually always wrong, and they must be criticized. We can't maintain our liberty if we don't have our first right to criticize what they say. And Thomas Jefferson has been quoted here today. So, one of my favorite Jefferson quotes is that error of opinion is tolerable as long as reason is left free to combat it. So who cares if some Nazi or some communist or some Republican or Democrat has some horrible, stupid thing to say about how things should be, as long as we can still contradict them and explain why they're wrong, and eventually, hopefully, win out in that free marketplace of ideas. Now, my solution is I want to see Facebook and Twitter both go the way of MySpace. And I'm not, the technical guy to pull this off, but I don't understand why these things should be websites at all, controlled by Jack or by Mark Zuckerberg or anybody else. These should be standalone applications where we network with each other, we add friends and add followers in the same sort of fashion, and we set our own algorithms however we want them. I want more McAdams and more Van Buren, and I want less Jonathan Katz. That's easy enough. And so it seems to me like the technology's there, the code is available, and these shouldn't be separate websites at all. They should just be applications that we can all use to network our computers together and create our own social media independent of any corporation or government at all.
That's great, Scott. Well, let's leave it on that high note, because I like the sound of that high note. And let's hope that technology is out there. We know it's out there, that it's deployed to deliver this kind of real more democratized social media. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this, I think, very important debate. I hope you found it interesting and stimulating. Please share it with your friends and with your enemies and comment below. And thanks for tuning in to the Liberty Report.